first one we're going to discuss today is going to be Cadman Plaza. This is the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood. I have to confess, I live right there. And this is the Cadman Plaza Park, and you can see this triangular little shape right here. This is going to be the urban renewal site. Cadman Plaza had begun as a conventional urban renewal project under Moses' leadership in the Slum Clearance Committee. And there had been much urban renewal already taking place in downtown Brooklyn. Downtown Brooklyn had seen the knocking down of many buildings and putting up of a new courthouse, putting up that Cadman Plaza Park where there used to be a trolley yard. And I could go on, but building many, many buildings, including Farragut Public Housing on the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge. And this was like the last piece of the puzzle, and it had been going back to about 1955. And according to Martin Schneider, who is a historian and participant of the Brooklyn Heights history, he had been involved in all these issues around the urban renewal and the creation of a historic district. He referred to it as a distinctly fading beauty with an aging population and an increasing number of single-room occupancy quarters in the neighborhood's brownstones, which was very typical of a lot of New York City neighborhoods in the 1950s and 60s. It was seeing an outflow of the middle and upper classes out of Brooklyn Heights. It had been previously a very exclusive upper middle class community, and an influx of African American and Puerto Rican migrants coming into the neighborhood like many other neighborhoods in New York City at that time period. The Times in this time referred to it as a sort of Greenwich Village without tourist traps, was their reference to Brooklyn Heights. And at the same time this is happening, people like Schneider, who are young professionals, are moving into the Heights. They're taking over brownstones, purchasing brownstones, and they're trying to rebuild these brownstones and upgrade them. And they're valuing these what eventually become historic districts, this old housing that had been really started to be dismissed by a lot of people in the city. And what was proposed in Cadman Plaza by Moses' Slum Clearance Committee was 772 mostly small luxury apartments that would have been on a super block. So it would have gotten rid of the entire street grid in that neighborhood. Renting, by the way, at this time, at $53 per room, which was a pretty pricey rent in the mid-1950s. The Brooklyn Heights community, these young people like Schneider, viewed this very negatively, because what they were looking for in this urban renewal project was to bring young families in. And if you're going to build lots of small studios and one-bedroom apartments, you are not going to be able to keep those families in the neighborhood and hopefully rebuild and rejuvenate the public school in the district known as PS8. Brooklyn Heights had earlier escaped Robert Moses' highway building. The Brooklyn-Queens Expressway initially was going to go right through the center of the neighborhood. The Brooklyn Heights Association had lobbied against this, and they eventually got what was known as the Brooklyn Heights Promenade along the edge of the neighborhood, which is now a landmark of the neighborhood. I mean, tourists are there every day looking at the Manhattan skyline, and they have the highway built underneath it. So they had defeated them once. The question was what was going to happen this time around with the Cadman Plaza development. What organized was these young professionals organized something called the Community Conservation and Improvement Council, which they called KIC, CCIC. Their main goals were preservation of historic buildings in the Heights, a reconfiguration of Cadman Plaza from a luxury development with small apartments to a middle-income development with large apartments to accommodate families, and as I mentioned earlier, the rejuvenation of PS8. This, by the way, is about 2 or 3 years before Jane Jacobs' publishing of The Death and Life of Great American Cities. So you can see sort of the same themes that she's writing about in her book and her activism in the village is also taking place in the Heights. The Times in December of 1959 laid out the choices for the Heights, whether they were going to build the luxury developments as Moses had built in Washington Square Village, charging rents of up to $100 a room, or were they going to go along with the KIC proposal of building middle-income housing. And this is, again, this sense of, and a lot of people were trying to keep the middle class inside of New York City. That was one of the goals of the Mitchell-Lama program in the middle-income housing, was to provide housing for middle-income people who would stay in the city. So they have this choice that's being laid out, as the Times laid it out, between the luxury housing and the middle-income housing. The other thing that they're looking at also is to stop the sort of tower and garden superblock from developing and to better integrate it into the neighborhood. This is my modern photo. And what you can see here, one of the things they wanted to build, and which they did successfully build, were these townhouses alongside of the high-rises that get built so that there's a greater sense of integration with the community. Another thing they do is they do keep a little of the street grid, and they extend, this is what's called Pineapple Street. And they extend the street through and turn it into a pedestrian mall. So it's a sense of trying to keep it together Here are some more of the townhouses. And you can see that there's another one of the high-rises that they're putting the supermarket on the street level so that there's a better connection with the street as it's being constructed. They didn't envisage the rehabilitation of existing housing. And there were other plans that had proposed that. One of them had wanted to build low-income housing that was incidentally endorsed by Brooks Atkinson, who was the Times famed theater critic in this time period. Another group led by a professor of art at Brooklyn College, a man named Martin James, came out with a very scathing review of this. It included endorsements from Congressman William Fitzryan, Jane Jacobs, Louis Mumford, Nathan Glazer, Stoughton Lind, Paul Goodman, and Eli Wilentz, who is the father of Sean Wilentz, who grew up in the neighborhood. And they basically said, we are tired of the bulldozer. And they proposed what was called spot renewal, that you would have like limited renewal of the buildings and keep most of the buildings in the area. They opposed the premise of traditional urban renewal, arguing that the area is not a slum. You know, one of the large debates, nobody lives in a slum. That's, by the way, nobody says they live in a slum. And they said, according to James, it had 2 Martin buildings and that other structures are substandard only in their present condition of upkeep, naturally neglected under the shadow of condemnation. Incidentally, they had found the building where Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass had been printed in that little urban renewal site. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess depending on whom you were speaking with, they failed. What they did get, though, in much negotiations with the Housing Renewal Board and Milton Mullen, was they did get these changes where it's better connected to the neighborhood. 60% of the buildings were made into Mitchell-Lama, middle-income buildings. 40% of them were the luxury development. So that was the end result of this. And they approved it on June 26, 1962. Milton Mullen got his way. But on December 11, 1962, the Housing Authority proposed public housing very nearby next to that urban renewal site. And they proposed 173 units of housing. And at the same time, they would build a larger school, a larger PS8. That was their bribe to the community. You know, build public housing, we'll give you a new school. But this debate continued. There was a lot of opposition in the Brooklyn Heights Association and within the Brooklyn Heights community. You were already seeing within PS8 a lot of the middle-income, upper-income families leaving PS8 as more blacks moved into the PS8, being bused in from Fort Greene. Families were putting their children into private schools. And they failed at this. So they failed in the public housing. The Brooklyn World Telegram and Sun reported that Abe Stark had removed it, and in response, the Congress of Racial Equality was picketing in front of Borough Hall, accusing Stark of, quote, trying to keep Brooklyn Heights a high-income ghetto for the white and well-to-do. What I found interesting about this was the parallels to the later Forest Hills controversy in New York City, when there was proposed public housing to be built in Forest Hills, and the neighborhood reacted, or many of the people in the neighborhood reacted with intense opposition. It became a major issue throughout the early 1970s. So CORE was not successful in getting the public housing, pushing for the public housing. What did happen, and Mayor Wagner gave a speech at that, describing the project as a new look urban renewal, saying, quote, the distinguished designs of the structure have shattered once and for all the stereotype of urban renewal projects as dull repetition of cookie-cutter designs. Very few people would describe Cadman Plaza as beautiful, but it was truly a break from the modernist tower and garden designs that had proliferated throughout New York City and the nation. What it did not address was the removal of low-income residents from Cadman Plaza and their ability to return to their neighborhood. The issue of urban renewal as Negro and Puerto Rican removal, as many of its critics called it, would be addressed directly in the West Side urban renewal, where an organized movement of the poor would challenge the traditional concepts of urban renewal.